Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 180, Stories from Fort William. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, in Fort William, in Portree and in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards the work that we do, then we're really, really grateful for that. And as I always say, I know when you say anything repeatedly, it kind of loses its a strength, but I really do appreciate it. As a service, we're very grateful to those of you who have been able to donate towards our work. So thank you very, very much indeed. It enables us to keep doing all the different things that we do. If you haven't donated yet and you would like to, then there's a link to be able to do that in the text. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. Thank you for all the lovely messages about last week, and also thank you to the people I've met in the last week or two who've kind of come up and chatted to me about Learn with Lorna. It's been really, really nice just to know that we've still got people on board, still got people who watch locally and overseas as well. So thank you so much. It's really, really encouraging to see, especially as next week, can you believe this? For those of you who've been here from the beginning, next week we are going into the 5th year of Learn with Lorna, which I just find completely extraordinary. So this week we are continuing our series of looking at some of the larger communities across the Highlands through the records that we hold in our collections. And this time we are looking at Fort William using documents from Lochaber Archive Centre. So thank you to my colleague Rory in Lochaber for helping me with this one. Fort William is one of the Highlands' 13 boroughs, but unlike Tain, Dornoch, Wick, Thurso, some of the others that we've already looked at, it's not a historic royal borough. Which is not to say that it's not a very significant historic place with loads of stories attached to it, but it's just never been a royal borough in the way that many of the others in the Highlands have been. But we'll come back to that and talk about why that is and what it was instead. So first of all, as always, let's locate ourselves. If anyone doesn't know where Fort William is situated about 62 miles southwest of Inverness, at the other end of the Great Glen. So with Loch Ness, the Caledonian Canal and other bodies of water in between. And as I always say, I'm sorry to navigate by Inverness. I'm sure that's very irritating for some people in the Highlands. But if you're not in the Highlands and you just know Inverness, then that's a helpful way of locating. It's the most southerly of the boroughs that we look after, sitting near the border of Argyll and Bute and sitting across the parishes of Kilmallie and Kilmanevig, which have undergone lots of boundary changes over the years. So for instance, Kilmallie, which used to be partly in Argyllshire and partly in Inverness-shire, moved to be entirely in Inverness-shire, and various bits of both those have been clipped and moved and added on to different counties and redesignated. There's been a lot of change in that Argyllshire-Inverness-shire boundary. And that's why if you're interested in researching people or places in that part of the world, it may be that we have some material in Lochaber and it may be that Argyll and Bute have some in their archives as well. Fort William, of course, also at the foot of Britain's highest mountain, Ben Nevis. The first statistical account says, amongst many other things, nature here appears on a majestic scale, and it is very fulsome in its description of the hills, of the landscape and the impact that that has on the community. So why was Fort William significant? What stories are set there, which makes them sound fictional, but which stories come from Fort William, and why wasn't it a royal borough in the same way as some of the others? Fort William is unlike the other boroughs that we look after in other ways as well. It has been known by various names over the years, and it still is today. So I will call it throughout this Fort William, but it's also known locally, generally known locally as the Fort, Fort Bill, of course, but also known as Angarrison for the garrison. So it still has several names, but with the amalgamation of communities and changing ownership and politics and the relative importance of the fort itself, Fort William has always had different names. And so this is both the story of a fort and the story of a community and how those two intertwined. And it's best summarised in the third statistical account. Now, I often speak about the first in the 1790s, often speak about the second statistical account in the 1830s and 40s. I don't often talk about the third statistical account. Written in 1954 and revised in 1966, this is what it says about Fort William. Fort William is situated near the head of Loch Linnhe at the southern end of the Caledonian Canal. The growth of the town dates from the middle of the 17th century, when General Monk, during Cromwell's protectorate, erected a fortress there in 1450. This fortress took the name of the garrison of Inverlochy from a neighbouring castle in Kilmanuvig parish. It had accommodation for 2,000 men, but was chiefly earth-built and altogether of a temporary character. It was garrisoned by approximately 200 troops from Ireland, who were landed from 5 vessels with a year's provision and plenty of material. A bare fortnight after they had taken occupation, Cameron of Lochiel swept down from the hills and attacked the fort, and many of the soldiers were either killed or drowned. In 1690, during the reign of William III, come back to that, the fort was strengthened and more or less rebuilt in stone by General Mackay. It was renamed Fort William, and the village that had grown up around it, which had been called Gordonsborough from having been built on the property of the Gordons, was renamed Maryborough. William III erected the village into a borough of barony and gave it a commonty for grazing cattle. The barony also had the right of brewing. In 1736, an action was raised in the Court of Session by the Baron Baileys against the governor of the fort and his superior, General Wade, on the grounds that they had no power over the inhabitants of Maryborough, the Duke of Gordon being the superior of the village. I'm going to break all this down in a wee minute. Judgment was given against the governor, whom it was ruled had no rights of property or superiority, and therefore could not exact ground rent. The people, thus assured of their security of tenure, thereafter began to erect more substantial dwellings, and for some years the borough grew in prosperity. The surrounding district, the Nevis Valley and the Strath of Lochie, was peopled by numerous crofters who depended on the rearing and sale of cattle and sheep. There was considerable cattle thieving in the time in Lochaber and Badenoch, and on Wade's advice, the government appointed sheriffs, justices of the peace and constables, and made Fort William one of the centres of the quarter sessions. So, a lot to unpack there. So, first of all, the fact that the town grew from the mid-1600s onwards doesn't mean to say that there was nothing there before that. Second, as I mentioned, that distinction between the fort and the community that grew up around the fort, and that divide is still really clear in the first statistical account, which mentions Maryborough or Gordonsborough as being within a few yards to the southwest of Fort William. So we now think of Fort William as that whole community, but it was very clear that the Fort William was one thing and Maryborough, Gordonsborough was something else. I mentioned those names changes according to who had the superiority, who had the influence at the time. It also at one point was called Duncansborough, so called by Sir Duncan Cameron of Fassfern. But it's Fort William which has stuck. And incidentally, we hold within our collections, the collections of West Highland Museum, which we care for, a 1654 letter from that first governor of the fort at Inverlochy, Colonel William Brain, writing to Oliver Cromwell, referencing General Monk and asking in there for provisions so that he doesn't have to send ships to London to get provisions. We also hold documents from the 1690s that detail the building and maintenance costs of the fort. And finally, from that kind of overview, I mentioned there that it was made a borough of barony in the reign of William III. Now, I want to make it very clear, this was the reign of William and Mary, not just William, as that third statistical account would suggest. They turned it into a borough of barony. So what is a borough of barony, and why is that different from a royal borough, given that the Crown grants both of these? Why is it different from a royal borough or a medieval borough? Here are the distinctions, the definitions of those words from the SCAN, the Scottish Archive Network knowledge base, that describe what a royal borough is and what a borough of barony is. Most royal boroughs were seaports, and each was either created by the Crown or upgraded, as it were, from another status, such as a borough of barony. An important document for each borough was its charter, creating the borough or confirming the rights of the borough as laid down by a previous monarch. Each royal borough, with the exception of 4 ineffective boroughs, was represented in the Scottish Parliament and could appoint magistrates with wide powers in civil and criminal justice. By 1707, there were 70 royal boroughs. On the other hand, boroughs of regality or barony were boroughs granted by the Crown to a secular or ecclesiastical landowner. The borough of regality was granted to a lord of regality, i.e. one of the leading Scottish nobles who held large estates and had wide powers in civil and criminal law. A borough of barony was granted to a tenant-in-chief, a landowner who held his estates directly from the Crown. So there's a layer in between that the granting has been given to that tenant-in-chief. Over 300 boroughs of barony or regality were created between 1450 and 1707, but many did not survive for long, and many others were simply parchment boroughs, which means that although they had been erected into a borough of barony, they never really developed further into a market town that had been hoped for. So we can see some of the differences there. We have a 1735 document in Lochaber Archive Centre which explains the significance of making Fort William, as I'll continue to call it, a borough of barony at this specific time. So I mentioned that it was 1690, during the reign of William and Mary, that Fort William became a borough of barony. So why did it happen? Why is it significant that it happened right then? The Glorious Revolution and the subsequent First Jacobite Rising that had arisen from it had happened in 1688-89. This was the enforced removal of James VII and II from the throne and the replacement by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. It was her claim to the throne that was why William and Mary became joint monarchs, and that was by my frustration about the fact that the third statistical account calls it the reign of William. It is the reign of William and Mary, which they wouldn't have had without Mary. So they had been crowned, removing the Catholic James VII and II. They had been crowned as Protestant monarchs in April 1689. There were risings immediately in support of the exiled James VII and II across the country. And it's with that background and that context that they erect this town, the town that we now call Fort William, with its neighbouring fort, into a borough of barony. And that 1735 document that I mentioned explains why they did that. The charter in Anno 1670 from King William and Queen Mary bears that, considering that the maintenance and support of a garrison at Fort William is of great importance to their crown, and may very much conduce to bring the Highlanders to the obedience of the laws and incline them to industry and policy instead of robbery and barbarity, which has so long been practised by them, their majesties do by their princely power ordain, create and erect to and in favour of the governor and commanding officer of Fort William at Inverlochy the bounds next adjacent to the said fort into a borough of barony, with all and sundry liberties, privileges, immunities and other commodities whatsoever pertaining and belonging in any way known to pertain or belong to any other borough of barony, to be holden to the governor or the commanding officer of the said fort for the time and their successors in all time coming. So really interesting. So it points out the fact that this was done in order to bring the Highlanders under control, to, what about that phrase, to encourage them instead, to conduce them to the obedience and incline them to industry and policy instead of robbery and barbarity. So it's a very political move to turn Fort William into a borough. It's to try and bring them under control. But the other interesting thing there is that it was the right, so the tenant-in-chief who was given that right of borough of barony was the commander of the fort, and that comes back to be an issue. So this document points out how unusual this setup was. It goes on to say, the constitution of this borough is very singular, for neither has the governor for the time, who is the baron, any superiority of the land on which it is erected. So He's not the tenant-in-chief, he's just the governor of the fort. But nor have the particular proprietors any right of property in the ground where they've built. So there's some confusion about who's in charge. The naked superiority of the privileges of the borough of Barony are conferred on the governor, to be holden of the crown, but the privileges themselves are conferred on the inhabitants of the borough. So it's very unclear about actually who is in charge and who has the right to do what, because if you give that right to the governor of the fort and all the successors of the governor, but then you've also got a landowner who owns the land that the fort is built on. So it's very interesting, very different to most of the other boroughs that we look after. Fort William and the surrounding area, the Lochaber area, can claim lots of interesting and significant families, but it is doubtless the Camerons of Lochiel who have been perhaps the most significant, and I've mentioned already the fact that Lochiel came down to raid the fort when it was built under Cromwell. I've spoken before about the Lochiel papers held at Lochaber Archive, so I won't go into huge detail here. It's a whole other episode if you want to go and track that down. But there's no doubt that this family and its historically Jacobite-leaning support has had a huge influence on the area, and is why Lochaber has some of the best Jacobite material in the country, both in Lochaber Archives and West Highland Museum as well. Which is a bit ironic, given the reasons that William and Mary created this borough in the first place. So let's return to the third statistical account to see where the Jacobite risings continue to play a part in Fort William's history. In 1715, the fort was attacked but not taken. In the absence of proper communications, it was difficult for the governor to enforce law and order until General Wade launched his great scheme of road and bridge building. One of his greatest local achievements was linking Fort William to Inverness by road. When the 45 rebellion broke out, the fort was poorly manned, but some gunners and additional officers were brought up from Inverary before the Jacobites opened their siege on the borough in the spring of 1746. The roof and walls of the fort suffered considerable damage by bombardment, but it withstood complete destruction. Though irregular and triangular in form, it was a very strong building with accommodation for 104 men. A ditch surrounded the structure, and it had a bomb-proof magazine and 2 bastions mounting 15 12-pounders. After the Battle of Culloden, Cumberland visited the fort and set in train the repressive measures carried out in the Highlands against those who had supported Prince Charles. Troops appear to have been stationed there as late as 1855, although latterly it was used as a military depot. The first parade of the Cameron Highlanders was raised by Alan Cameron of Erracht, was in the fort in 1793. After the 45, Maryborough, which had been largely destroyed during the Rising, was rebuilt and became an important Highland port, carrying on a considerable trade in the latter part of the 18th century. Exports including salmon, herring, deerskin, dried white fish, and imports comprised mainly rum, gin, Norwegian timber, wines from France and Spain. And we hold many documents that talk about, detail those turbulent years of the 1700s, including in the Cameron of Lochiel papers, a memorial by John Cameron of Fassfern describing his experiences when imprisoned by military forces in Fort William in the fort in 1746. And so we come through and you see already how influential the Jacobite risings have been, both from that creation of the borough of Barony by William and Mary through to the impact of the fort during the 1700s. And so we come into the 1800s with the tumult of the Jacobite risings largely behind us after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, but with an entirely new sort of disruption around the corner. And it would seem that Fort William at the turn of that century wasn't a very inspiring place to be. This was written by Anne Grant in 1807. I have no spite against the place, but I am provoked at its superabundant negatives. It's a seaport without being animated. It's a village without the air of peace and simplicity. It's military without either being gay or bold-looking. It's country without being rural. It's highland without being picturesque or romantic. It has plains without verdure, hills without woods, mountains without majesty, and a sky without a sun. At least, His beams appear so seldom that I wonder the Lochabrians are not dazzled into idolatry when he walks in his brightness. Just seems to be like the most fantastic, scathing review of a place. Fairly offended on behalf of Fort William. That reference to mountains without majesty seems a bit harsh. And also, I can't disagree with the fact that the comment there about a sky without a sun. It does maintain that reputation a little bit. But it did make me laugh out loud. 1807, somebody writing that about Fort William. But then it's a sentiment that's echoed a few years later by the famous author and photographer M.G.M. Donaldson, because she wrote, "Fort William, one of the few places in the Highlands to which you only go so that you may get away from it and onto somewhere else with all possible speed. As usual, it is because man in his handiwork shows himself indifferent to God's endowment of natural beauty, that the ugly little town, compacted of hideous buildings, incongruously defaces the landscape." Some pretty strong wording there. I'd like to say, I think that's pretty unfair, apart from the rain. But Fort William continues to be a destination for walkers, for bikers, for hikers, and lots of other people, as the fantastic Ben Nevis Observatory Visitor Book reveals. Here are some entries from the Ben Nevis Visitor Book from the observatory that used to be on the top from 1884. So William Caldwell said on the 5th of August from Belfast, "The crowning point of Scottish scenery, overstepping all." So beautiful. And then Ahmed Mitra says, who's come from India, says, "I believe that I am the first Indian Mohammedan who has ascended this hill and a few more in the Highlands." So we can see people coming from across the world to climb Ben Nevis, to be in Fort William. However, even in this 1884 book, there are some comments about the weather and about the size of Ben Nevis. Somebody from Leeds, Greg Bray, writing from Leeds in 1884. "It would add to people's interest in the observatory and assist in procuring subscriptions if luncheon was provided." Bertie Borthwick from Fife said, "Missed the view, viewed the mist." William Gunn from Inverness, "After experiencing the difficulty of dragging my mortal body to this elevation, I have full admiration for your perseverance in planting a miniature hotel here in the region of eternal snows." Henry Nielsen from Glasgow wrote, "Hill climbing is much overrated." Walter Shaw from Edinburgh, "A good road for shoemakers and dealers in corn plasters." Someone else suggesting that maybe it would be best if a railway, sort of akin to the railways of Snowdonia, could be put to the summit of the hill. So we see that although people were not super enthusiastic always in the 1800s, they did continue to climb the hills. Now, I mentioned that coming out of the Jacobite risings, we've left one set of crisis behind, but we're about to come into another one. The 1840s would throw crisis after crisis at Scotland, and we can see through our collections how these events impacted Fort William and impacted Lochaber. The disruption, the creation of the Free Church by the breaking away of hundreds of congregations from the Church of Scotland, can be seen in not only church records but in estate papers and other records as well. There is a petition to Donald Cameron of Lochiel revealing the Free Church community's wish for a free church school to send their children to instead of a Church of Scotland run school. Some really interesting wording in it. Your petitioners are professing Christians deeply concerned in the godly upbringing of their children who are the rising generation. They go on to say they can't entrust the education of their children to the care of an establishment from which they themselves have, on what they consider sufficient ground, seceded. So how can we send our children to a school that we have, run by an organisation we have just broken away from? They reference the Toleration Act, which should allow them to worship and to educate their children according to the dictates of their conscience. We're still 30 years away at this point from the Education Act and the state-run schools. And then following hard on the heels of the disruption comes the Highland potato famine and those waves of starvation. I referenced this in the import and export episode recently. The potato failure started in 1846, sorry, numbers wrong way round, and the effects lasted around 10 years, causing misery and hardship, although it has to be said much less than the hardship that was faced in Ireland. And Rory has written a blog about this, so do check out the Lochaber Archive Centre website for this. There's a blog about this. And we hold various documents that reveal the impact of this famine, but also the attitudes of the time. So for instance, this is an 1850 letter written by Martin Roberts of Torlundy, so just outside Fort William. When the potato formed the chief food of the Highlander and was cultivated with little risk of failure, his condition was free from want and misery, although not one of progress for the better. But as the potato has now failed him, the habits of indolence and ignorance of agriculture engendered by the cultivation of that root are now beginning to tell. He is daily becoming more and more depressed, and unless some immediate steps are taken to arrest this rapid deterioration, the Highlands of Scotland will soon become one vast pauper settlement, second only to Ireland in destitution and helpless misery. The chief remedy for this evil is to teach the Highland peasant a better system of agriculture than he now practices, and afterwards to enlarge his croft or farm. I insist on the necessity of enlarging the croft, because he cannot earn money wages, there being no paid employment in the district, and if he has no means of buying food, he must grow it for himself and his family by cultivating the soil. So an aim there for the fact that we need to extend croft sizes, we need to learn how to grow and self-sustain things other than potatoes, so we're not hit by this kind of crisis again. And when we look at the Lochaber poor relief records, the records for Kilmally, we can see the scale of the crisis. The board are of the opinion that there is not in the parish sufficient quantity of grain for supporting the population for more than 6 weeks, which the potato crop is so completely decayed as to be utterly useless. So there's no potato and there's not enough grain. The number of people who will require aid is about 2,500, nearly 1/2 of the whole population of the entire parish. To provide for these, it is recommended that each proprietor should, after the fullest inquiry into the circumstances of the people in his own property, divide them into classes. So there should be first class, a group of first class who would be all young men and married men without families, and they should be recommended to seek employment in the south at railways or public works so as to diminish the pressure on food and employment that could be produced. They could also go away and earn money to send it back to support wives and parents. And then second class, all married men under 55 who have numerous people depending on them, who also have wives and mothers who could take charge, should also be advised to seek employment in the south. But if you can't leave the country, then you'll be in the third class, which also includes those over the age of 55 or people whose health doesn't permit them to leave. This third class is recommended to the peculiar class for the landlord, who it is hoped will make sacrifices for the purposes of making regular employment for such as could work. So if you possibly can, go away from here, earn money somewhere else, take the pressure off the food supplies and send money back. Then goes on to say that the committee consider it absolutely necessary that some such plan as the foregoing should be adopted without any delay, preserving the population of this parish from the consequences of famine, and at the same time the board record it as their deliberate opinion that work should be provided to as many as possible near their own homes. By 1857, the situation had become so bad that the heritors, the magistrates and the clergymen of Fort William district wrote to the government for help, stating that thousands of people were now bordering on a state of famine and that the poor relief system simply could not cope with the demand that was being put on it, and several people did die as a result of this. Many others, following the establishment of the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society, left to assist. That was a society that was in part set up to assist those affected by the famine to leave. So, although some have argued that that has basically constituted a continued clearance. So we can see that Fort William was impacted at this point by waves of starvation, waves of hardship and crisis and emigration, like much of the rest of the country. As we come into the 20th century, of course, conflicts continued to cause heartbreak and loss to the town, which incidentally since 1874 had also now been a police borough. And no family was exempt, as I have spoken about many times and as you will all be aware. Very, very few were exempt from the suffering of the First World War and the Second World War. Camerons of Lochiel, as well as everybody else, lost family members in exactly the same way that anybody else in the town did. And a look at Fort William's school records reveal one such loss. Mr. Primrose Fairweather was appointed to teacher at Fort William Higher Grade School in 1911, bringing with him a wealth of qualifications in everything from constitutional history to political sciences. He was to be paid £120 per annum. And in February 1915, just a few months after the outbreak of World War I, he left school, being a teacher, to join Kitchener's army as a volunteer. And like so many other people, he would not return safely at the end of that conflict. He was killed in action in July 1916. And the school minutes, which recorded his appointment and recorded all those qualifications he had achieved, those same school minutes go on to detail that he has left a bookcase with 50 volumes of historic manuscripts, historic masterpieces that he wished should be left to the pupils of that school if he didn't return. And in the 20th and 20th centuries, Fort William became and remains a haven for those who love the outdoors and sport. And Jen, as you say, it is indeed featured in programmes including Outlander, so it is a place, unlike Anne Grant said in 1807, it is a place dear to the heart of many people. But it became particularly associated with outdoor sports by people including Sheila MacDonald, who was the first woman to climb to the summit of Kilimanjaro, aged 22. She's an all-round fascinating person who lived in Glen Nevis and later in Fort William, and whose notebooks we hold. So Fort William is the history of Fort William, literally that of highs and lows, of bonfires and parties and celebrations on top of Ben Nevis, being the first town in Britain to bring electric lighting to its streets that were lit by hydroelectricity, but also of battles and forts and conflict. It exists because of conflict as a fort, and that fort has been very central to its story. We hold a really wide range of records relating to Fort William, from the borough records from the 1870s onwards to papers of businesses, including the chemist who sold midge repellent to the US Army during their commando training in World War II, but of course a lot of family papers and estate papers as well. It's a really fascinating history of a borough that is a bit different to some of the others that I've talked about. So we've spoken about Dornoch, about Tain, about the role that education has played in our boroughs, that religion has played. Fort William is very much a place where conflict has been important in shaping its story. So thank you for joining me to have a look at some of the stories that are in our Fort William records. Next week we will be revisiting Inverness Borough to look at some more stories from some of my absolute favourite collections. And as I said, please join me for that one, because it's the start of the 5th year of Learn with Lorna, which is absolutely extraordinary. I've been in this job for 10 years and it's mad to think that I'm going into almost half of that time now of being part of this community with you. So thank you for that. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are really, really grateful for that. And hopefully I will see some more of you in the next week, as I've been enjoying doing in the last few days. So thank you very much.